I want to get into that more. I have some questions about different spiritual practices that you recommend, various modalities that have helped you. But maybe before we get back to that, I can segue into how I met you and how we're here now. I remember hearing about you a few months ago from a friend, and they were talking about how you were discussing plant medicines, your own recovery story, and your name Suburban Sadhu also kind of perked my ears. I felt like that idea was it was really intriguing because like maybe that's something that's missing from the suburbs. And I kind of really liked that idea of a suburban sadhu. And when I heard these bits and pieces from mutual friends, I was really bummed out that I didn't get to hear you speak, and especially um, on the plant medicine part. So for the viewers that may be watching, I am someone that has used plant medicines in the past, sometimes innocently just to experiment, and sometimes for healing purposes. Unbeknownst to me, that was a side effect of having done them, was kind of organic healing. And now that I'm in sort of a abstinence-based recovery, I can't help but wonder and feel that there is a great power and benefit to these plant medicines. And so I heard about Suburban Sadhu, Drew, and I asked him if he would talk with me for about an hour, and that was just left an impression on me because you were just so gracious and really cool to talk to. And I figured, you know what, got this small upcoming channel, what better opportunity than to talk to Drew and sort of pick his brain. So that's how we got here. And yeah, thanks again, man. If you would be so kind, do you want to talk about sort of I haven't got to hear it, the preceding years before you kind of come into this this flavor of a suburban sadhu, this kind of calling, and what were the formative years of trauma? What kind of got you into recovery and spirituality?
Yeah. So I, I I don't know if it'll switch when I start talking, but that's the button I clicked. um,
Oh,
yeah, I mean the current incarnation or the current evolution, whatever you want to call it, of the suburban sadhu idea is more recent, and I don't know. I feel like I've been in an ongoing like identity crisis for maybe most of my life. Definitely most of recovery. Um, and one of the classic like inquiry questions is like who am I? Like what the heck is this? So that's been a question that's been part of my experience for as long as I can remember. And yeah, and so I spent years looking for who I was supposed to be or who I thought I was, in lots of different ways, almost entirely external. And I think that played a big part in active addiction too, and driving some of the pain. And yeah, and then in early recovery, it was like, okay, I found some relief in being able to identify, like, oh, okay, like I'm an addict. That's why, like, these things are playing out this way, or that's why I struggle with certain behaviors or beliefs, or certain features of the experience. Um, so yeah, so it was nice to like identify that an addict, and then a recovering addict was really nice. And then I invested years in an abstinence-based approach, a 12-step approach to recovery. So then that was like the identity. And yeah, and essentially like the addiction led to the recovery, and then the recovery, the more I invested in recovery, the more it really kind of like started to open up into, oh, this is like a spiritual trip, man. Like this is what I thought I was doing when I was tripping balls or eating mushrooms, or like this is now a grounded, practical way to really like live this stuff. And
right.
yeah, but I still had some, yeah, like identity stuff to work out. So I like went back to school, and then I was working in mental health, and I was a counselor for a while, college professor, and all that. But nothing ever quite totally fit. Like I could kind of make it work in a particular role, or I could squeeze into a circle hole as whatever shape I am, but it never really felt like it was me. And yeah, and it turns out like I'm not a role, I'm whatever I am. And so this suburban sadhu idea is very much like me just making up a name for what feels right. Like I'm a suburban kid and all that comes with that. And but I'm also very much, like working for the universe, and on a, I would say I'm like a seeker, but that really has, like, the end of seeking is the end of the seeker too. So like in a way I've kind of like found myself in this identity vibe of like, okay, yeah, like I'm a sadhu that started in the suburbs and doing the spiritual walk and connecting with other beings on a similar wavelength and holding space. And then I have all the background as a therapist and a counselor and all the great stuff we learn in recovery. So then I can show up and hold space and guide folks when the time feels right. So
Right, right.
yeah.
Now, how has it been for you since just throwing the name onto how you feel? Have you received, has your interactions with helping others heal been any differently since um, trying on that hat?
Yeah, so, I mean, like most folks don't know what a sadhu is, so they
You
just,
want to explain? You want to explain to us what a sadhu is?
yeah. A sadhu usually is a term that's used in uh, yeah, more like mysticism or a mystic path, right? Like a person who's kind of renounced the world or renounced material stuff, and is kind of walking a spiritual walk or a holy walk or a sacred walk. And so yeah, like a wandering holy guy or a wandering monk or whatever, however you want to call it. If you go to like India, like I was just there for a little while, there's a bunch of dudes like just wandering around in their orange robes, and yeah. So, and there's not really that in, like in Western society, we don't have that. We're kind of like a very spiritual bankrupt society for the most part. We have lots of organized religion, but we miss the mark on an actual embodied spirituality, or like a recognition that the spiritual dimension of life is not something separate. It's very much part of the experience, if not the core of the experience. But yeah, but in other cultures where spirituality is a little more valued or a little more recognized, yeah, there's dudes whose like job or role in society is to be like that flavor of being, and so yeah, so I just really resonate with that. But I'm also from the suburbs, I'm from like suburban
Yeah,
New
yeah.
York City, and I like Wi-Fi and air conditioning, and I cuss too much, and I can talk shit on the NBA and the NFL and all. So like I was raised in a particular way, and I've tried to like spiritual away that in the past. But like I am what I am. I have a certain flavor to me. So
Yeah, you feel like a slap shot, you know?
yeah. So yeah, so I'm like a suburban flavored guy who works for the universe, and then that feels good for me too, because it allows me to show people a little more authentically. And then the collaborations and the work that I do with folks is much more on a like self-discovery, learning about yourself, accepting yourself, like in that sphere, as opposed to in the past or my clinical days as a counselor and a therapist. It's like, okay, what's the diagnosis? What's the treatment plan? How do we treat the disorder? And that always felt a little weird. Um, I mean, it's helpful, it's useful to have language and certain approaches that we know are effective, but it didn't feel like it was totally my gig. Whereas this feels like, oh, okay, yeah, like I'm here to help people learn about themselves, because I don't really think people are like screwed up or broken or disordered. We don't know ourselves, so then we're out running around blind.
Right, right. So do you feel like when you were a clinical psychiatrist or a psychologist?
I was a licensed addictions counselor, and I went to school. I got my master's in counseling, and I was on the track to be like an LPC, like a licensed mental health therapist. And I got my licensed addiction letters along the way. But before I got my final counselor letters, I started to discover more about myself and more about healing, and start to get introduced to plant medicine and more native and aboriginal approaches to healing and wisdom. So I like stepped out of that trajectory, and then let my letters go.
Was it sort of something like where you got to see that you could love more authentically how you want and heal how you want outside of the constraints of maybe the regulations of being a CADC, counselor?
It, yeah, kind of. I mean, it was more like the framework didn't seem to fit. Like, so I would offer that. I mean, if we look at our current society and we look at treatment as it is, and how we deal with mental health and addiction, like we're not super successful, which tells me, like, if you can't treat something successfully, it means you don't actually understand it, right? So, to me, like, I think the reason why we don't actually understand addiction or a lot of the mental health issues is because we're looking through a lens that's actually too small or like too focused in one particular area. So it was like, okay, did we not discover the right treatment approach yet? Or is the idea of this being a disorder and us needing to treat it, is that whole framework part of us missing what's really going on? So
Okay.
that makes sense. So like the framework itself was too limiting, if you will. And yeah, so I was like in the field working, and then the theories and the psychology is cool, but then the actual application in the world of treatment is a total different ballgame. So, so I got to work in the field and burn out a couple times and earn my stripes and all that jazz. And at the same time, I was working in the field. I needed like more self care to deal with working in the field, and then that's when I started to get turned on to like sweat lodges and a more like native Aboriginal approach and perspective. And then I wound up in Peru with the plant medicine and a couple other experiences. So I was like reaching the limits of the clinical psychology paradigm. At the same time, I was like realizing the expansiveness of different approaches. And so it's kind of like an easy, natural drift. And then I just had to get my head around it because I had a lot of energy invested in the guy with the degrees and the counselor and who I think.
Yeah. Yeah. That must have been incredible though, to be in that Western medicine mindset and then just have it flip to Aboriginal plant-based medicines, traditions, sweat lodges, ceremony.
In some ways, it was like almost a natural evolution. It wasn't so much like a flip. It was more like, okay, I learned the newest thing on the block, which is the clinical psychology framework, which is only a couple hundred years old, right? It's like, all right, I learned the new thing on the block, and then that got me in touch with the stuff that's like thousands of years old. So then I just like, it just evolved in a way. And so it's like, oh, okay, cool. Like psychology is like one approach to helping people or healing or, supporting or whatever, but it's just one gig. Like there's multiple ways to understand the human experience and then approach it from different angles and perspectives to, to live more authentically and also to potentially support people in their own journey too. So, yeah, yeah. And I mean, like I still pop in and out of it, like sometimes if I'm sitting with somebody, we're in more of a learn about yourself mode. And then sometimes when we do our own work and we reflect, we get in touch with some stuff. And then some like trauma pops up or, there's some anxiety that comes to the surface. And and so then I can tap that. It's like, oh, okay, I've sat with trauma before. All right, I know the different approaches and protocols to anxiety, and I have personal familiarity with it too. So yeah, so it's cool because then I can bang and bounce around from different tools and approaches as kind of is appropriate for what presents itself.